Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to On the Middle East. My name is Amran Zaman, and today I'll be discussing the latest developments in Armenia's ongoing quest to make peace with Azerbaijan and Turkey. That effort was given a huge boost when President Donald Trump intervened this year, catching all the stakeholders by surprise. He invited Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev to the White House in August, where they signed a document committing to peace. But more consequentially, they agreed to the establishment of a land corridor running through Armenia to Azerbaijan's Soviet-era exclave Nakhichevan that borders Turkey. My guest today is Eric Hacopian of CivilNet, an independent online media and television platform in Armenia. Eric explains how Trump has effectively prevented Azerbaijan from attacking Armenia again in the near future by forcing the sides to sign the corridor deal. Welcome to our show, Eric.
Pleasure to be here.
So, you're in Yerevan and you have a great grasp of everything that's going on, because we follow CivilNet very closely and we all know that it really is one of the best outlets for understanding what's happening inside Armenia. So tell us, what exactly is happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkey? We had this great ceremony at the White House recently, and everybody was saying, okay, this is done. Peace is nigh, but yet it doesn't seem to be.
Well, first thing I would say is anybody who tells you they confidently know what everything is going on is not being truthful, because there's frankly too many moving parts. What happened? Let's start with the more important thing, frankly, in the big scheme of things, which is the meeting of the White House. Many people think that's where the peace agreement was signed. That's not the case. The peace agreement that's been negotiated was actually not signed. It was simply initialed. And I suspect that that peace agreement, there's a very good chance it'll never get signed for very specific reasons, as far as from the perspective of the Azeri government and the regime, which makes complete sense. What happened was that essentially the U.S. made a power move to take over, for the lack of a better phrase, the dispute, and to take over the building of this road, the Trump Road, as they call it, through the Sunni part of Armenia that connects the two parts of Azerbaijan. And by doing so, essentially put the issue to sleep, because many of us expected, and many Western governments expected, an Azeri invasion of some kind of Armenia in March or April of this year. And this agreement and the U.S. involvement probably prevented that, because the cause belli was going to be this road through Sunik. Now, this road, the way it's negotiated, it's going to be under sovereign Armenian control. The company that will run it will be a U.S. joint Armenia company. Obviously work within the context of sovereignty of Armenia. What's also interesting is the side agreements between Armenia and the U.S., which involved rare earths, minerals. There's a lot of things like that, opening up the waiver of parts for the Armenian IT sector, and for our defense sector. So there's a lot of side things that are relevant, but universally, what happened is the U.S. stepped in, essentially in one swift move, moved the Russians out of the region, as the broker of any kind between these two countries and took over that role. And by doing so, because of that, the US still has the credibility as the leading power in the world, and to the extent that, to be frank, Ilham Aliyev fears Donald Trump, as many people do. What we avoided was likely any kind of an aggression over the next couple of years. And if you avoid aggression over the next couple of years, the window of aggression would be over, because by that time, Armenia will have deterrence capacity. And by the way, this also opens up U.S. weapons purchases for Armenia, which was the only Western country that it was not open to. So essentially, we prevented a war by having Donald Trump have his road. And that's pretty much about it. As far as the peace itself, there's two ways to look at peace. We're talking about peace. If you're talking about peace as a universal thing, peace and reconciliation, that's not in any way in the cards. That sort of died in September of 23 with the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. That's not going to return. You can't have real peace after those images are stamped in people's minds. But I do not see this peace agreement ever being signed, because Azerbaijan has absolutely no incentive to ever sign it. They got everything that they wanted, which was an ethnically cleansed Nagorno-Karabakh back, without any condemnation. Aliyev is still welcome. He's not part of the Lukashenko-Putin club. He's welcome everywhere. And he paid absolutely no price for it. And if you understand internal politics in Azerbaijan, this government, this regime, has almost nothing to offer her people. They're already the poorest people in the Caucasus. They're obviously the least free. And you had an Armenian enemy for 30 years, which is quite convenient. We've seen this countless times. The totalitarian regimes always have an outside power to hate. And in this case, the Armenian enemy was a very convenient one. The moment you sign a peace treaty, Ilham Aliyev's problems all become internal.
Well, what you just said is actually fascinating, because on the one hand, you're saying Donald Trump did not achieve peace, but he averted war. So
yes, absolutely.
that's extremely significant. For the Armenians, that's a huge win, isn't it?
It is. Essentially, he bought Armenia 3.5 years, and by doing so, the war in that after time period, because of military upgrades, weapon systems arriving. The thing is, you can always start a war, but if you are an Ilham Aliyev, if you're going to start a war, you have to have 100% win. You cannot, the risks of an aggression of that kind without 100% certain outcome is not worth taking. And anything past this year, you're not going to have 100% certain outcomes, which makes the likelihood of aggression far less.
But that road is going to be built, Eric. I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you saying the road will be built?
Oh, yeah, I'm almost certain that the road will be built. I think the road will be built. I don't see how this road will become economically viable, to be perfectly honest with you. But he will get his road. He will get the U.S. contractors building it, other things that go into it. He will get whatever props that he wants. Where is this road 10 years from now? I have no idea. But yes, from a universal perspective, this is not about peace. This is about avoiding a short-term war to buy Armenia time, to buy deterrence, to build deterrence capacity. And Aliyev knows this. And there was intense pressure on Ilham Aliyev to get to Washington and sign this. In so many words, the Americans held a diplomatic gun to his head. Now, you might ask, why is that? I think it's because in order for him to go to Washington and sign this deal, he essentially had to burn Vladimir Putin. Because it's very clear that in September of 23, part of the price, what he owed Putin, was consistent aggression against Armenia, because originally this supposed road was supposed to be guarded by the Russians and controlled by the FSB. So in essence, he threw Putin under the bus. He never wanted to do that. He was forced to do it by the Americans threatening him. So despite all of this nonsense about how this was a great diplomatic victory, it might be a victory of some kind for him. But if you talk to people behind the scenes, he was forced into doing this. In fact, a few days before this event, the Americans leaked this, so he can't get out of it. And if you've noticed, there's Azeri-Russian relations has taken a big hit in the negative direction on both sides as a result of this.
No, we see that now with the gas being cut off to Azerbaijan, supposedly for technical reasons. But
Yeah.
who is going to provide security? They talk about private contractors from the United States. And of course, for Iran, that is pretty awful, isn't it?
It is, but Iran is a much distracted and diminished entity at this point. To the extent that President Pezeshkian flew here. President Pezeshkian flew to Stepanakert weeks after the Azeris allowed their territory to be used to attack Iran. It's something where everybody knows. This is not any kind of a secret.
You're talking about overflights, Eric?
Yes, yeah. Everyone knows that Israelis use both northern Iraq, Kurdistan, and Azerbaijan to launch drones into areas of Iran that were not accessible to them. Specifically, the attacks on Tabriz Air Base and other places. Everyone knows they came through Azerbaijan because there's villagers on both sides that see these things going through. So this is not any kind of a secret. But Iran is such a weak, diminished figure that instead of having Iranian rockets land in Azerbaijan, he flew to Stepanakert to an event that Ilham Aliyev was holding. And a few weeks later, he flew to Yerevan, in which he said this road, in so many words, is not a problem. The security for the road, I suspect, will be done by third-party vendors, maybe US, Qatari companies, things of that nature, that will provide security for people driving through it. I cannot imagine any scenario that it involves US forces, US armed forces, or anyone related to them. That's very clear, because that would be a needless, pointless provocation to Iran. And that's not necessary, to be honest.
And once Armenia establishes deterrence capability, then that again, of course, further cements peace, correct?
Absolutely, because the reason we have, in the US military parlance, there's this thing called full spectrum dominance, Once you step away from that, and deterrence capacity is meaning that the other side doesn't have full spectrum dominance. And once that happens, peace just becomes a lot more likely. Listen, the most likely scenario over the next 10, 15 years in this region is not peace. It is a very is a no war, no peace type situation, bending towards peace, in which there's not likely to be another war, or at least some major altercation over the next 10, 15 years. What happens after that is a whole different other issue. I am afraid that, eventually regimes like the one in Azerbaijan do not last forever. They have internal contradictions. It's a country whose economy moving forward is simply going to diminish. And I'm afraid eventual internal crises in that country is very likely to lead to another war, because in some ways, Armenia's fate is not married to Azerbaijan, because anyone who's in politics in Azerbaijan has learned that you can solve your internal problems by aggression against Armenia. And that's a lesson that's not likely to be unlearned. So what I fear is that when that 0 hour comes, when oil is done as a major commodity and where the regime is on his last leg, there will be a war. That's what I'm afraid of. We likely have, if you look at the trajectory of regimes like Azerbaijan, it's a Syria type situation. Syria is completely different because of the ethnic breaks. But as you know, there's no good ending for regimes like that.
Well, where does this leave the Turkey-Armenia peace track? Because we all know that Turkey embarked on this positing that unless there was peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan first, there could not be peace between Armenia and Turkey. And you have just explained very eloquently why real peace is not within reach, at least not in the foreseeable future. So where does that leave Turkey and Armenia?
Well, I do not see. I think the Turks will hold to their word to the Azeris that they will not establish full relations or open the border entirely until Armenia and Azerbaijan sign a peace deal. However, in truth, the Turks are on some level had it with the Azeris because they understood the game that they were playing for the Russians, which they didn't like. The Turks were fully on board what was done in the White House because the Turks wanted the Russians out of the region, while the Azeris didn't necessarily want them out of the region. So that there's always these two nations, one heart, whatever the line is. But there's always contradictions between states. There's no two states that have the same issues and the same agenda. I think there's greater potential of developing Armenia-Turkey relations as far as I can totally see that this road gets completed and the railway between Kars and Gumri opens, or the border opens. You can have something of that sort. I think that's far more likely because that's sort of a halfway measure. Because if you actually read the document, the road, the Trump road, is supposed to open as other communication systems open. And opening up the Turkey-Armenia border is far less problematic than opening up the Armenia-Azerbaijan border.
Then why is Pashinyan jumping through all these hoops? I mean, really bordering on the absurd, frankly, removing Ararat from a border stance. I mean, why would Turkey find a border stamp threatening, for God's sake?
I am not certain that that's what the Turks demanded, to be perfectly honest with you.
Why? I mean,
I think this I think you have to understand that there's a very specific context of sometimes, you have regimes and governments in which there's a very distinct small ideological line that very few people hold, but they'll push it regardless of anything. And this government, the current government in Armenia, is what I would refer to as anti-nationalist. And there's a very distinct reason for it. These are people that have lost multiple wars in 5 years. They were responsible, or they were in power for this probably the greatest disaster in Armenian history since the genocide, when it was the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. So you have two choices. You either take responsibility and take your part, or you try to delegitimize the history or the history of the struggle or nationalism in general. So if you think about it logically, he has said things like the Karabakh struggle was a result of Soviet ideology, which is ridiculous on the face of it, because the Soviets were the ones who actually created the problem and prevented it from being solved. So this is they have a minority point of view, which frankly doesn't even win them any voters. There's nobody who's going to be voting for him next year who will vote for him because of this issue, despite the fact that it made countless number of people angry. When it comes to this anti-nationalism, they're almost ideological. They're like, the Stalinists going after the church in the 1930s. So they have this ideological bent, which is anti-nationalist, but it's a very convenient anti-nationalism. It's not based on political principles. It's based on the fact that you have to explain how are you responsible for the largest ethnic cleansing of Armenians since 1915 to 1920. So the best way to do that is to say, that entire effort was illegitimate. So I think this comes, that it could have been possible that the Turks asked for this. I think it's far more likely that they didn't ask for this, because this doesn't even make any sense.
It doesn't really, to be honest. I find it very peculiar, but I also wonder,
Anyway, if I can say one thing.
Yes, please.
Paradoxically, the foreign minister doing this is named Ararat.
Yes, Ararat Mirzoyan. Very true. I'd forgotten about that.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
Eric, where does this leave Pashinyan? When you look at the polls, he still is ahead, even as his, numbers keep slipping, which is a testament to how, I guess, shoddy, deplorable, weak the opposition remains. So can we assume that he will win next year, despite...
He is likely to win, unless there's a third force opposition. And I know there's a lot of there's going to be a third force opposition that runs. How much they take off is a whole other matter. I can totally see that happening because I know the things that are going on in the background. There will be new forces coming into the political system. That will happen. However, listen, there's two things on some level, like you asked this question about Arat. Most Armenians in general do not pay attention to what politicians say, because to them, they're all people that have no credibility. So that's why there's not much outrage over some of the things he says, because no one takes him or anybody else seriously. This is not a country that follows political leaders in that way. He's got two things going for him. And one is, I wouldn't say peace, but no war, because people do not want another war, because everyone knows the country is not ready for war. One. Two, economic prosperity. Per capita income in Armenia has doubled in the last 5 years. And that it's a combination of that. And the third one is the Western pivot, which is actually quite popular. Those three things he's got going for him. And barring a third force coming into play that is credible, that is not tied to this current, not very bright opposition, he will win, but he will win by default. But it will not be because of any of these silly things that they're doing, which are ideological and don't even make any political sense. But there's the overall view, if the average people don't really care if a peace treaty is signed, as long as their nephew at the border is not in a war. That's how ordinary people think. And given the fact that the country is on an economic winning streak, and integration with the United States and the West is actually quite popular, that's enough for him to be able to win against the current opposition. But as you know, in politics, things can change on a dime. Some character can show up over the next 6 months. There's dynamic, that's a whole, when the time is right, politics serves its purpose. But at this point, he will still win by default because of these externalities, which are involved: no war, economic growth, and integration into the West, which is happening rapidly and is actually quite popular. And, essentially the Russian position in Armenia has entirely collapsed.
Right, it's entirely collapsed, but ironically, to some extent, Russia's involvement, or rather occupation war against Ukraine, has benefited Armenia. This whole IT sector has sort of boomed as a result. So this economic boom that you speak of, how sustainable is it? How organic is it? And what would opening up borders with Turkey do to that? Would it be a good thing or a bad thing? Because people worry that Turkish exports will flood the market, local producers will be undermined. Tell us just a little bit about that, please.
The economic growth is sustainable, most likely for one reason. Economic growth that we have now in Armenia is essentially as a result of monopolization, de-oligarching the economy. So what you've done is you've essentially allowed the wild spirits of people to take over in an environment in which there's no more limitations. The growth that Armenia is having right now is the growth that we should have had 15 or 20 years ago in a normal political system or a normal economic system in which you're not bound by monopolies and unfair competition. So some of this is really catch-up growth. It has very little to do with any. So you unleash people's entrepreneurial spirit, and then they go. This has been joined by sort of the Armenian IT sector going from an outsourcing area to a startup scene. There's 3 or 4 Armenian unicorn companies, that are worth more than $1 billion. And that scene is going very quickly, growing very quickly. Third is the international footprint here. NVIDIA's here in a significant way. And NVIDIA's like the hottest, depending on the day, is the most valuable company in the world. AMD, which is the other chip design company from the United States, just moved into Armenia. So there's a lot of generic things happening on their own. It's like they've all come together, and you have this. So it's sort of building up like that. Then you couple that with, the EU spending on infrastructure, nothing like they did in Georgia, but still it's coming through. So honest taxation, on the eve of the war in 2020, Armenia's budget was like $2.5 billion compared to Azerbaijan's 15 or 16 billion. Now Armenia's budget last year passed 9 billion to Azerbaijan's 20. So you can just see what actually taxing the rich, making sure that your basic governance things and just the massive investments that are happening inside of the country, because it's sort of like, when you invest in infrastructure, it pays off, creates jobs, half a dozen different things. So generally, it's a positive economic direction, and it is likely sustainable because it is not based on one thing, and it's not based on external sources. For example, there's almost no FDI in Armenia. It's actually very limited compared to other places. Foreign direct investment is rather limited. And it would be, because this is not a place you're going to build a refrigerator plant or a car plant. It just doesn't work like that. And in the modern economies, there's not, to start up for NVIDIA to move here, they don't need to invest anything. What does the Turkish border opening mean? Most likely less than people think, because Turkish goods are all over Armenia anyway. They just come through a longer
But
road.
they'll be a lot cheaper, won't they?
They will be somewhat cheaper, 10, 15% cheaper. Transportation cost will be less. Exporting things will be cheaper. But you're talking about things in the margins. You're talking about saving 10, 15% in transportation costs. The biggest risk is to the poorest people in Armenia, which are people in agriculture, because the Turkish agriculture sector is far larger, so it's got economies of scale, and it could actually overwhelm local producers. But there's likely to be more good than definitely more bad that comes out of the border opening, frankly, for both sides. Because as you know,
tourism is an obvious area where there'll be tremendous growth.
Tremendous. I mean, listen, there's not. You would get probably 1 million people a year that will cross the border to go into
Ani.
Eastern Turkey. Yeah, they will. It's gonna. The Turkish provinces next to Armenia statistically are the poorest provinces in Turkey.
Yeah.
So the trade turnover, what's one of the reasons, by the way, the Azeris never wanted to be open, because once you open it, there's too much incentive not to close it. It becomes much harder to close when a lot of people are making a living from it. And in fact, on per capita income basis, Armenia itself, because the Turkish provinces next to it are much poorer, will actually have more positive effect than the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a win-win. So my final question to you, Eric, is you said that Russia has pretty much collapsed in Armenia. So the risk of Russia doing something bad, bumping off Pashinyan, something like that, a black swan moment, you think is pretty much zero?
Well, the Black Swan movement was the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh, which they thought would lead to the collapse of this government. In fact, it led to the collapse of the Russian position because everybody blamed the Russians rather than this government, even though this government had its own fair share of responsibility. The Russians have tried countless times, and I don't want to spill state secrets, but I wouldn't say they haven't tried to kill him. Let's just say that. They just haven't succeeded. The thing is that everything the Russians have done since the invasion of Ukraine against Armenia has actually backfired. It's actually made them, the Russians, they're very active in propaganda, false news, fake news. They'll spread it, mushroom sites. They're so good with that. They really, are skillful. But what they're not skillful with is telling a positive narrative about themselves. And that's the problem, is because what matters in a country like this is the aspirations of young people. And aspirations of young people, not just here, even regionally. I mean, it isn't like the West is, everyone understands the problems of the West. But if you ask the average 25-year-old, they don't want to become Belarus. They want to become the Czech Republic. And that's actually universal, whether they're Ukrainian, whether they're Georgian, it's the same thing. The problem with the Russians is that their narrative is not one that people are attracted towards.
So has
So
the
they,
upward flow of young people sort of slowed down, Eric?
oh, from Armenia?
Yeah, because that was always a big problem, wasn't it?
Yes, you get people coming and you get people, yes, just a mass movement. No, you don't have that. Like, I mean, when you see, like, for example, polling in Turkey, it'd be like they're under 30s, 80% of them want to leave the country. And that's not like 80% can ever leave the country, but generally, no. I mean, generally, yes. There's far less of that. There's no mass migration of people. There's always people that will go because you will do better here. If you're in banking, it's better to be in New York than in Yerevan. Okay, that's just a fact. If you're really hot in IT and you got a startup, you need to be in San Jose rather than in Yerevan to start with. So there's generally yes, but it's as you know, it's complicated. It's just not an absolute thing.
But I mean, overall, the picture that you've painted is a positive one. Um, and it sounds like Trump may actually deserve his Nobel Prize,
Uh,
given that he's helped avert war in the Caucasus. That's pretty significant. And kudos to Pashinyan, I think, because however much one critiques him, he's been incredibly bold. It takes some guts to do some of the things he's done, whether it's because of his ideology or whatever. I think Armenia looks to be in a pretty good place, Eric.
well, the funny part is, and I get this all the time because I'm an American myself, as I am an Armenian, and I'm in the United States. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump for obvious reasons. But the fact that there's two things. One, the fact that he is perceived to be crazy is because part of that madman theory. People are afraid of him. So Aliyev was never afraid of the Biden administration. In fact, he never respected them. But he's genuinely afraid of Donald Trump because, just talk about Pastor Brunson and what he did to his good friend Erdogan. He crashed the lira by 20% over some silly pastor. So and the fact that his administration and Witkoff are full of these very hardline, deadline-oriented real estate people, you can't play them. You can't say all the diplomatic games that can be played. They're going to tell you, you need to give us an answer by this date. And in fact, he was told to give an answer about this Trump road by July 31st. It's either that or you deal with the consequences, and then he flinched. So Trump's, the madness of King Trump is useful in certain places, and this is one of those places that he's actually
But we
helpful,
also have to
regardless.
give some credit to the American ambassador to Christina Kivien because I hope I'm pronouncing her surname.
Yes, you are.
And because after all, I doubt that Trump even knows or knew where Armenia was on the map. So
You mean Albania? You mean Albania?
Albania and Azerbaijan. But but the diplomats, they still have some role, thank God.
No, no, they've been, listen, I think you just have to give credit where credit's due. Something good has come out of this,
Oh,
which is
totally.
the prevention of
Sounds
war.
like it,
And
yeah.
yes, even Pashinyan in his own uh, strange way, yes, he is very bold. And I'll tell you this much, he is a provincial figure in Armenia. And no, you had to be a provincial figure to make this big break with the Russians. Because if you were in any way, the favorite son of the establishment, you would have known too many people in Russia. You'd have gone to school in Megimo. You would have had too many relationships there to make as drastic of a change or a break as he did, because it is exceptionally risky. Because if you actually step back, there was this tag team between Baku and Moscow to always pressure Armenia because they thought Armenia had no options. This I know for a fact. The one thing that really has surprised both Baku and Moscow is the fact that there was a market for Armenia in the West. They never expected that, because that's the way people in those countries think, because they think in these immediate power terms: who's got money, who doesn't have resources, who has this. There's no dynamic forward thinking about the potential of a place. Or if you actually look at the map, anyone who was interested in dismantling Russian presence in the Caucasus, you had to do it in Armenia, because that's where they had the most influence. So you could not collapse the Russian position in the Caucasus without collapsing the Russian position in Armenia. So they never thought in these terms, and they never thought there's a market for Armenia in the West, because they don't really look at the Putins of the world and the Aliyevs of the world do not think in the terms of where does NVIDIA go. They think about pipelines, they think about raw power, they think about where do I deposit my money. They're very smart, they're full of shrewdness, but generally entirely lacking in wisdom.
Well, the world has changed a lot too.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, Shnara Kalutun, as they say in Armenia, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fascinating, very illuminating conversation, and more power to you and CivilNet.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and joining you is always a pleasure. So just let us know; we'll always be there for you.
Thank you. And this brings us to the end of this episode of On the Middle East. I'm glad to have shared encouraging news today. May there be more. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.